Welcome to the Full Stack Svelte course. We're going to be learning how to develop and deploy a full stack application with Node.js, Express, Mongodb, and Svelte. We will be starting from the beginning, so don't worry if you don't have any other previews with Node.js or Svelte. Svelte is a really cool frontend framework, and according to the 2019 State of JS survey, is the leading framework in the interest that people are having for it. My name is Esteban, and I'm really glad that you are taking this step to become a great Svelte developer. Now let's take a look at what we are going to be building today. So we're going to be building this express tracking application, and we can have either expenses or income. So we have items for every transaction, and here we have some summary. So we have all the income that we have, all the expenses, and the balance that we have in general. So I can add another transaction. In this case, it's going to be an expense, and this gets added to the DOM, and also is in the backend. So we are making API calls to Express. Then we can also remove items, and the summary is changing every time we change and delete a new item, and we have a different balance. So that's the application, and as you can see, this is live in the internet. We are using Heroku, and I'm going to be teaching you how to deploy this. It might look very simple in the surface, but there's a lot of stuff going on here to make this work. What are the tools that we are going to be using to this? We are going to be using Mongodb for the database. We're going to be using Express. It's a really popular framework for the backend, and we also be using Svelte.js, of course, and Node.js as the backend. So this is the stack that we are going to be using. And what you are going to be learning today, you're going to be learning how to create an Express REST API, how to configure Mongo in the cloud, how to set up a Svelte project, and also all the features that Svelte has, like reactivity, event binding, logic blocks, and so much more. Also, how to make calls to the Express backend with Svelte, and we are going to be using a proxy to have the same URL. Also, how to use the Svelte store, so we are going to have some state management. And finally, we are going to deploy the Express application to Heroku along with Svelte. So if you're not here, please subscribe to the channel so we can have more content like this. I am also planning and releasing another part when we also have authentication. So please stay tuned, and now let's start with the configuration. Okay, so now let's get started with MongoDB. We are going to be using MongoDB Atlas. It's a service that we can store our MongoDB in the cloud. You could also use any other platform, or if you prefer, you can set up a local MongoDB database, but this is what we are going to be using in this tutorial. So we have a free plan that we can sign up. So it's a sandbox that we have access to most of the features that MongoDB has. So just create a new account. I already created the account, so I'm going to close this. And this is what you will get when you first start the account. I'm going to choose the free cluster. So this is the one that we are going to be using. And then we can set up some configurations here. So we can select of all our cloud provider. I'm going to be using AWS, and then we are going to be using a region. Probably you want to choose the region that's closer to your location. I'm going to go with this one. Then we can have a cluster name and some additional settings that we are not going to use right now. So let's create the cluster. Okay, now the cluster has been created and we have to wait some minutes so this is activated. I'm going to pause the video and we will be back. Okay, now that we have our cluster created, we are going to set up the connection so we can connect our application with the cluster. For doing that, we are going to click here, and here we have to add some initial settings. So the first setting is that we need to add an IP address. So this in a production application will be the IP address of your server. You could also use your current API address, the one that your computer is using, but the problem with that is that that IP address will probably change in the future. So we don't want to change that all the time. So what we are going to add is a public IP address. That means that everyone is allowed to enter the server. So this is the one that we are going to be using. This means that everyone can access this cluster. And probably if you are going to make a production application, you don't want to have this setting. But for the purpose of this video, this is what we are going to be using. And this is going to be a public access. Okay, we have added the IP address. Now we need to create an user to access the cluster. So for this, I'm going to be using the admin, create the admin username, and I'm going to use this strong password so we can have that password for this instance. So make sure that your password is strong and make sure that you save this information, because this is what we are going to be using in the future to connect to MongoDB. Let's create the user, and now let's go to the next step. So we have set that up. Now the way we are connecting to the database is through our application. So we are going to click here, and this is the configuration that we need to enter the cluster. So I will just copy this and make sure that you save this, and you have to replace this with your password, and then you can access the cluster. So that's pretty much it on how we create the cluster. Now let's move on how to configure this in our application. Okay, now that we have created our MongoDB cluster, now let's make sure that you have installed Node.js in your computer. So this is what you need to run the JavaScript in the backend. So you will need Node.js, and also make sure that you have installed Insomnia. So you can also use another tools like Postman, but in this course we are going to be using Insomnia, so we can test our API endpoints with that. Now let's open the terminal and create a new folder. This folder is going to be called expenses tracker. I'm going to cd into that folder, and now let's initialize a new npm package JSON. So for doing that I'm going to call npm init, and I'm going to pass the jest flag so we have everything quickly. And let's open this folder with VS Code. Okay, so we have our package JSON and we don't have any dependencies by default, so let's add all the dependencies that we need. So I'm going to npm install, and the first one is going to be Express. So this is the framework that we are using for the backend. Next, let's add Mongoose. Mongoose is a tool that allows you to create schemas and connect also to MongoDB. Another thing that I want here is I want CORS. So CORS will allow us to connect from the front end to the backend without any problem. Another one is body parser. So body parser will parse all the info that the data that we receive to the application, so we can have JSON. And the last one is going to be Morgan. Morgan is a logger that can console log all the HTTP requests that we have, so we have some logging of what's going on. So let's add the save flag, and this is going to install all of these dependencies in our project. Now that we have that, I forgot, we also need this called concurrently. So this will allow us to run the front end and the back end at the same time in development. So I'm going also to have this library concurrently, and this one is just for development, and the other one that I need for development is NodeMon. So NodeMon can help you to run every time you save a new file. You can run, the application will react to that change and will be restarted. So let's add NodeMon, and I'm going to save this in the development packages, and we pretty much have all the dependencies that we need for the backend. So now that I have that, I'm going to create a new file called server.js. So this is the entry point for the server. Let me change this. And what we want here is we are going to test to check if Express is working. So I'm going to import Express, and I also going to create a new app. So we are creating the Express app, and I'm going to declare a new port that we are going to be running this application. And now let's start declaring the basic route. So for doing that, I'm going to declare app.get, and for the route I'm going to have a callback that has the request and the response, and I'm just going to say rest.send hello world. So this is going to be our hello world for now, and then I can listen this app in the port that we have, and when this is completed, we are going to console that log Express is running at port, and here we can have the port that we are listening. Okay, we have our hello world. Now let's test this out. So I'm going to open up the terminal, and for the first time I'm going to use Node, and I'm going to type the name of the file, And there we have it. Express is running at port. Express is running at port 3000. So I'm going to test this with the Insomnia, and let me check if this is correct. And there we have it. We have our hello world. So we set up the server, and now let's configure the client. So I'm going to stop this for now, and I'm going to start with the client. So for the client, I'm going to use a template. So we can have some boilerplate for Svelte in this case. And for having this template, I'm going to use npx digit, and I can access this template called Svelte.js, and this template is for Webpack. So we are going to be using Webpack for this configuration. You could also use Rollup, but for this example we're going to use Webpack. And we are having a name for this. So the name for this is going to be client. So this is the folder that we are going to create, and it's going to be here. So let me run this, and it's cloning the template, and there we have our client. Now let's go to the client, and sorry, so I'm just going to create a new one, and I'm going to be to the client, and I'm going to install all the dependencies that we have in the client. So let's take a look at what we have here. So these are all the dependencies that we need to install to run our Svelte application. So it's just some Webpack tools and the Svelte compiler. So as you know, Svelte is a compiler. We don't have any direct dependencies here, only our dev dependencies. So I'm going to install everything. This is going to take a little bit, and let me just move to the package.json. So as you can see, we have two package.json. We have one for the server and one for the client. So the one for the server is the main one that we are going to be using in production, and this is, for now, this will also help us to develop our application, and has all the information that we need. So let's move to the package.json of the server, and I want to add some scripts here so we don't have to run this every single time. I'm going to add some scripts for doing that. So the first script is the one for running the server. So it's going to be server, and what I'm going to run here is I'm going to run node mon. So this is the tool that allows you to refresh our application every time we save, and I can target this to the server.js. This is the file that we need to listen to, and I'm going to use the ignore flag, and what we are going to ignore is the client folder, because we don't want to restart the server every time we save the client. So that's what I need, this ignore flag. So we have our server script. So let me test it. I am in the root of the folder, so I can run npm run server, and you can see that this is working. So every time we save, let's change this to 4000, the application will be restarted, and we have the latest changes. So we have our server script. Now let's add in the package.json of the server, let's add another script for the client, because we are going to be running this from here. So if I want to run the client, I'm going to have this script that says it's going to have npm run dev, but this dev script is going to be called in the package.json of the client. As you can see, we have a script that's going to run the development server. So what we are going to do here, I'm going to add a prefix flag, and with this we can access the client, and this means that this command will be run in the client. So this is what is going to be run. So we can save that, and let's test this script. We can say npm run client. So now the project is hosted in localhost 880. So let me test that. And there we have it. We have our Svelte application. So we have the client and we have the server. And what I want to have now is I want to have a way to have this at the same time, to be run at the same time, so I don't have to have two different consoles for doing this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have a dev script, and this dev script, what it's going to do is going to use the concurrently. So this is the tool that we installed before, concurrently, and this allows us to run two scripts or more scripts at the same time. So for doing this, I actually need to have this in backslashes, and I'm going to run npm run server. I can close this, and the other command that we need is this one, that's going to be npm run client. So these are the two commands that we need, and I need to close it. So this will have the client and the server at the same time. So let me just test this out, and I can run npm run dev, and what this is going to do is going to run the client and the server. So we have the client and the server, and now let's test if that is working. So I can go here and I can see that the client is running, and I can go here and I can check that the server is not running. So let's see what will run. npm run server, npm run client. So I have the port 3000. Concurrently npm run server. Oh, I am in the client folder. So you don't want to have this mistake. So I just run the dev script for the package.json of the client. So make sure that you are in the root of the project, and now we can run the current script. So I can run this one again, and this should be running both. So we can see that it has the two outputs, the one from the server and the one from the client. So let's test that out, and we have the client and we should also have the server. Yeah, so we have both. Okay, so we have configured our scripts. Let me pause this, and now I will try to connect to Mongodb. Okay, for doing that, I'm going to close the client for now, and I'm going to add a new file called config.js. So this is the place that we are going to have our configuration for the server. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say module.exports, so we can export, and what we are going to export is an object, and I'm going to have, for now, I'm going to have two variables here. The one is going to be the port, so this is the port that the application will be run, and we want to have the default value is going to be an invariable variable. So we can use, for example, if we are in production, we can use the one that we have in the server, and if we don't have this, we can fall back to the port 3000. So we have the port, and I also want the Mongo URI. So this is the variable that we are going to be using to connect to Mongo. So this one is the one that we have here. As you remember, we need our user and we need our password. So let me add that here, and I can have this connected to MongoDB. Okay, so here we have one problem that I don't like, is that we have this in our code and we don't have to check this because this is a secret and we don't want anyone to know that we have this server that they can access with these credentials. So what I can do is I'm going to declare an environment variable. So let me clear this, and I can say export, and I'm going to declare this as Mongo /URI equals, and between quotes I'm going to paste the value that I'm. So this is another way to declare this variable. You could also move, and if you're going to have it this way, you should have this in your bash profile. Otherwise, this will be cleaned up every time you close this terminal. So maybe you want to have this in your bash profile, so you don't have to enter this if you are going to use the variable like this. So I have that, and I can now access that variable from here. So I can say process.env.mongo URI, and this is going to access this variable. You could have it like this, it's more secure, but you could also have the string here. Just make sure that you don't check this file to Git, so this is not compromised. So we have our configuration, and now we want to use that configuration here. So let me close this, and I can start. I'm going to import this information. So I can say I'm going to destruct the variables, and I'm going to say require, and this is coming from the config file. And what we need to use here is the port, so we don't need this variable anymore. And we also want to import the Mongo URL. So this is the Mongo URL that we are going to be using. And now let's connect the server to MongoDB. For doing that, I'm going to use Mongoose. So I can say const mongoose equals require, and we are going to import Mongoose. So we have Mongoose, and we can say we are going to connect here, and we can say mongoose that connect, and this has mainly three parameters. The first one is going to be the URL, So we have that Mongo URI, and the next one is some configuration. So I'm going to say use new URL parser true, use create index. So this is the configuration that we are passing to connect to Mongo, and I can say use unified topology, and it's also going to be true. So here we are connecting to MongoDB, and because this is a promise, this is not going to happen right away. I can then use and this has a callback that's going to be called when this is successful. So if this connection is successful, we are going to just say console.log, and we can say MongoDB database is connected. So we were checking if this happened, and I can also catch the error because we could also be passing some bad information. So we are going to have an error here, and I'm going to console.log that error so we know what happened. So we have our configuration. Now let's test if this is working. So we should be able to connect to the database. In this case, I'm going just to run the server because I don't want to have all the webpack output. So I can say npm run server, and this is going to call our server, and we can see that this is successful. So we are now connected to MongoDB. So this is the initial configuration. We are going to first start working in the backend, creating our routes, and then we will be moving to the front end to interact with that API. So this is the configuration so far, and let's move on. Okay, now the first thing that I want to do here is I'm going to create a new folder called modules, and I'm going to create a new model for MongoDB. So this model is going to be called transaction. This is the model that I want to create, and this will be for every single item that we have in our expenses tracker. So it could be an income or output. So this will be called a transaction, and I'm going to declare how this transaction should look like. For doing that, I'm going to require Mongoose, and for Mongoose I'm going to use the schema and also to use module. So these are some utilities that we can use to declaring this. So I'm going to say const transaction schema equals, and this is will be a new instance of schema. So we are creating a new instance of schema, and this is where we are going to have the schema definition. So this is going to be an object, and it's going to have two properties. The first property is going to be the value. So this will be the money that the user is entering. It's going to be type of number, so it's going to be a number, and it's also required. So if we don't pass this will throw an error, and we can say true. So we have the value, and another property that I want is to have the date, so we know when this happened. And I can say that the date is going to be type number, and I can add some default So I want it to be a number because it's easier to handle timestamps. So a timestamp is a representation in numbers of a date. So for getting a timestamp, I can say I'm going to have this now variable, and it's going to have new date. We are using the JavaScript date object, and we can, from that, we can have the time, and this is going to gets the time value in milliseconds. So we have the timestamp, and this is what we are going to store. And if the user doesn't pass anything, we are going to use the default. That's going to be the current value. So this is our schema. Now we need to declare the module. So for doing that, I can say transaction equals, and we can use the module function, and we need to pass the name of the module. That's going to be transaction, and we need to pass the schema. So we already created the schema, and there we have it. We have the model, and I'm going to export this so it can be used from outside. So model that exports equals transaction. Okay, we have declared our module is module. It's a really simple one. We only have 2 properties, but it's good enough for this project. So now that I have my module, I want to create a separate folder called roads, and this is where we are going to have all of our API roads. So I'm going to create the one for the transactions. So I'm just calling this transactions.js, and this is where all the logic for the API endpoints is going to be. So for doing that, I'm going to import. So I can say I'm going to require, and what I'm going to require from Express is I want to use the router. So we can have a new router, and I'm also going to use the model that we created. So it's going to be transaction, and we are going to require this from the other folder that we created, and there we have that. We have what we need, and I'm going to create a new router. So for doing that, I can say router equals router. So this will create a new router, and we can define all of the endpoints that we need for this router. So the first endpoint is going to be the root one, that we can retrieve all of our transactions. So I'm going to say router that, this should be lowercase. I'm going to say router that get, and the first thing that we need to pass here is we need to pass what is the path that we are going to use. In this case, it's going to be the root, and then we can we have a callback when this is invoked, and for the callback we have the request and the response, and this is just an arrow function that we are going to using, and this is where all the logic is going to be. So this is what the function that will be invoked when the user enters this try to access this path. So we are going to use async. Async is is a wrapper for promises. So we can have asynchronous code here, and we are going to use a try catch block. So because this could either have a good status or a bad status if something wrong happens. So I'm going to say const transactions equals, and we are going to await, and because we declared transaction as a model. So this is going to find all the values in the database. So this is going to make a call to our database, and it's going to find, and because we didn't pass anything here, it's going to find all the collections that we have for this model that has all of our transactions. So if we don't have any transactions, we are going to throw an error, because this means that something is not correct, and we can say throw new error. It's going to be no transactions. Otherwise, if everything is good, we're going to send to the user res.send, and we can pass the first we want to pass the status, declare the status. So this is going to be 200. It means that everything went correct, and we are going to send some JSON to the client, and the JSON is going to be the transactions. So this is getting the transactions for the database. It's checking if there is no one, it's going to throw an error. Otherwise, we have a 200 response with the transactions. And for the error, I'm going to say res.status, and this is going to have a 400 because it didn't went well, and we are going to send a message so the client knows what went wrong, and we are going to use the error that message. So we are going to send this message that we declare here if anything go wrong here. So we have our get endpoint. Now let's create the one that we are going to use to create new transactions. So I can say router.post, and I'm going to use the root of this folder again, and because this is a post request, I can use the root path. And again, I also have this kind of callback that I can use, and I also will be using an async function that has an arrow function. So what's going to happen here? So the things here are a little bit different. We need to access the body of the request. So hopefully the users send us the right information, and we can say rect that body. So this is going to read the body from the user, and because we use the body parser, this is already JSON that we can use. And from here we want to access the properties that we defined here, the value and the date. So we can say value and date. We are just destructing the properties from the body. So we have that, and we can say const new transaction. So this is the new object that we are going to post into the database. It's going to be new transaction, and we are using the module, and we can say, and this is the JSON that that we are going to store. So this is going to have the value and the date. So we have that, and now let's try to save this to the database. So for doing that, I am also going to use a try catch block here, and I can say that the transaction equals await new transaction. So this is the instance that we created, and this has a property that is save. So this is and this is an asynchronous call, and will be awaited, and this will save the value to the database. If we don't have a transaction, means that So, and because we are using the model and the schema, this will be validated. So if the user passes any wrong data, it will not be saved. So we can say if there's no transaction, it means that something went wrong, and we can throw another error. So I'm going to copy this, and I can say there was an error saving the transaction. Otherwise, if everything was good, we can say res.status, and this is going to have a status of 200, and we can just pass the JSON, and the JSON is going to be the transaction, so what the user saved, so they know what's the ID and all of that. And if anything went wrong, we can say a status of 500. It means that it's a server error, and we can say we can send the JSON, and the JSON is going to have a message property that will have our error that message. So we have our post endpoint and our get endpoint. So now that we declared that, let's test this out to see if everything is working. For doing that, I'm going to start only the server for now. Oh, there's another step that we are missing. We declare our router, but we are not using the router in the server. So for doing that, I'm going to export the server module that the router that exports equals router. So we are exporting this router, and I can use it here. So for doing that, I can say transactions routes equals require, and I'm going to require that file from the routes folder, and I have the file here. And what I want to do is, after we connect to the database, I'm going to app.use, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to declare a root path. So because we have our paths here are root, but we don't have that to be root in the general application, I can say API transactions. So this is the root path for that router, and I can use the transactions routes here. So I added that, and we have the transactions that we will be calling in this URL. So there's a couple of things that I want to add here that I didn't add before. I want to use some middlewares that we installed. The first one that I want to use is course. So I can say course equals require. So this will allow me to access the API from the browser, and I'm going to use course. We have course. The other one, I want to use body parser. So this will transfer any data to JSON that's coming. So I can say in the body, of course, body parser equals require, and this equals body parser. And the last one is Morgan. So I'm not sure if I installed Morgan. Yeah, we have Morgan. So this is going to check for every HTTP request, and is going to log that to the user, to our application, sorry. So we can say Morgan, and I'm going to use these middlewares. For doing that, I can just say app.use, and it's going to use course. We have course. The other middleware is going to be app.use. We're going to use body parser, and the parser is going to be JSON, and the other middleware is going to be Morgan. And for Morgan, I'm going to pass a configuration that's going to be tiny. So this is the log that we are going to be is not going to be that large. So we have everything here. and I think we're ready to start the server again. So let me open the terminal and we can run the server. Okay, the server is running, MongoDB is connected, so let's try this here. So we have our hello world. Now we are going to try to access the transactions, and we have an empty array because we didn't add any transactions yet. I'm using a get endpoint and we don't have any transactions. So let me just post a new transaction. So I have the same, and I need to add the body here. So the body is going to be JSON, of course, and we need a value. So the value is going to be, it's a number, it's going to be 12. And a date, I also need a date. Oh, I can pass it without a date because we have a default value. I can pass it without a date. So let me check if this is working. As you can see, we have the date that is generated by the server, and we have our ID and we have our value. And if we go back here, we can see that we have an array with one single value. So we have our API, but we also need another post endpoint. We need to be able to delete a transaction. So let's add that to the server. So I'm going to, and there we have our logs. We are logging everything. And I'm going to close this, and I'm going to my routes, and I need another route here that's going to be router.delete. So this delete is going to have a param. So we need to use a parameter here that's going to be a param that's going to be in the URL, and it's going to be ID. So this allows Express to identify that this is a parameter, is a dynamic value. And I can also use a sync function that has a request and also has a response, and we are declaring the function, and we can say try, and also we can catch that if we have any error. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to access the ID from the param, so I can say const ID, and I'm structuring the rect params. So we have this object that has all the params that the user is passing, and then we can access the ID, and we can say now that because this is going to be asynchronous, we can say const transaction equals transaction find by ID. So we first need to find that transaction to see if the transaction actually exists in the database, because they can say anything here. So we are checking that the transaction actually is in a database, and if it's not, we can say if it didn't found any transaction, we can just throw an error here that will say no transaction was found. So we are just throwing an error, and if everything went well, we can say rest status is going to have a status of 200, and we can say let's send the ID to the user so they know what they deleted, and we are sending the ID. Otherwise, we can catch the error, and we can say status. So this is going to have a 404 status because we didn't found anything, and we can just send the JSON that's coming from the message that we have. Let's change this to error and error that message. Okay, we have our endpoint, and because we are running node mode, this was actually was the application restarted, and let's try this out. So we can take this ID, this is the ID that we have from the get endpoint, and I can use this to pass it here, and hopefully this will delete the transaction. As you can see, this was successful, and we have back the ID of what we deleted. If I go here and I try to access all the transactions, what happened here? So we have a bug here. Let me try that again. We are deleting. Oh, I know what's happening here. So we are just finding but we are not removing the transaction from the database. So this is just finding the individual transaction. So for removing, we actually need to say remove equals await, and we are going to await to transaction that remove, and this will remove the transaction because this is using the module. We can have this method that will allows you to remove the value, and if we don't have any response here, we can throw another error, and this can say there was a problem. There was a problem deleting the transaction. Okay, now we are actually removing the value from the database, and this restarted correctly. Now let's try this again, and this should now works. Okay, we had a problem here. Remove transaction that remove. Oh, I can see now why. Because we are checking if this exists. We want to check if this does not exist. That's when we are going to throw this error. I would think that this was actually removed, and if we query the get endpoint, we should have an empty array, as you can see. And now let's test everything. So this will have, I don't know, 20. We have that, and we can remove this from the database, and now we have the ID, and we have 200. And we should have an empty array. Okay, so we have our server ready. It's ready to be connected to Svelte. So let's check that out next. Okay, now let's move on to the client. So I'm going to access the client folder, and the first thing that I want to do here, I'm going to make some changes to the Webpack configuration. So what I want to add here is I want to configure something for the dev server. So this is the configuration that we have for the development server, and I want to add a proxy here. So what this proxy will do is every time this development server is going to add the API path, so this is where our API is living, we are actually going to pass this request to a target that is going to be or where we have our API. So in this case it's going to be http://localhost in the port 3000. So this is where we are going to redirect all the calls that we have in our server when we use the API path, because the server is running in the port 8080, we need to proxy that to this port. So we have added that configuration, and what I want to do now is I want to do some cleanup that we have here, because we have an app by default, and I'm just want to delete this, and because we don't need this. So this is our main, we don't need this property. And let's take a look what is happening here. We are just importing our app component, and we are targeting that to the body. So this is how in Svelte we do that. In the main.js file, we just import the file and we target that to the body, and we are exporting that so it can be compiled. We also have the public folder here, and this is the index.html where the bundle is loaded. And what I want to do here, I'm going to change this to expenses tracker is the title. I also want to remove the fav icon, and I also want to remove this global CSS, because we are not going to be using the CSS, a global CSS. We're going to be using a CSS framework for this. So this framework is a really nice one. I really like it. It's called Bulma. It's nice because we don't have any JavaScript here. We only have CSS. So this does not include any jQuery or anything like that function. And for importing this, we can use the CDN. So this is the link to the CDN, and this is what we are going to be using today. So we have some nice styles that we don't have to write. And I'm also going to delete this, because we don't use it anymore. Okay, we have cleaned it up, and we have a hello message here. And let's now, right now I'm just running the server, and I'm going to pass that, stop that, and I want to run the server and the frontend and at the same time. So we are going to use our npm run dev, and this is going to execute what the frontend and the backend at the same time. So as you can see, this is running, and we are serving the port 8080. So let me check that here, and if we refresh, there we have our hello message that we changed it. Okay, so this is going to be our main component for now, and what I'm going to do now is I also need another library. So I am in the root of the project. I'm going to cd into the client, and I'm going to install Axios. Axios will allow us to access the API really easy. You could also use Fetch for doing this, but I like Axios because it has a very API. So npm install Axios dev, save, and make sure that you are in the client, so you install this in the client, not in the server. So I'm installing Axios. I'm going to restart this server because probably it needs to run again to have Axios, and we have compiled everything. So I have everything what I need, and now let's move on to the component. So Svelte components have three main parts. So we have the script. So this is all of our JavaScript will be where we are going to write all of our JavaScript. We also have the style tag, and after this we can write any HTML markup. We don't need to use any special tag. We can just write HTML here and it will be rendered. So in the script part, the first thing that I want the input, so the user can enter any transactions to the DOM. So for doing that, I'm going to use a Bulma CSS classes. So let me go back here, and if I go back to documentation, I can see that we have some forms, and the form that I want is one that has a select box and a button. So let me go back here, and this is the kind of form that I want. So I will just be copying this and use it in our template. So let me go here, and this is the part where I can paste this, and I don't need this is where we can write HTML. If we go back to our application, we can see that we have what we wanted, but this is looking too big. So I'm going to add another HTML class that's going to be app, and this is going to have all of application. And I can also add the CSS Bulma class called container, and this will make sure that this is not too big. Actually, this is still too wide, so I'm going to add some custom styles, and by default the styles in Svelte are scope, so everything that I write here would only be applied to this component. I can say that app, this is the CSS selector, and I'm going to say I'm going to first add a margin, so I can say 40 pixels at the top and the bottom, and the size will have an auto margin, and I can say max width, and the max width is going to be 5000 pixels, because we don't want this to be that bigger. Now let's check how this looks a lot better. So let's change some things here. So we are going to change the button. So I don't want this to be an A tag. I can just use a button tag, and this is not going to be a transfer. This is going to be a save button, and here we don't want these options. We want to have a plus and a minus. So this is how we want this to look. So if we go back, this is looking nice, and we have our HTML for that. Now I want to be able to add these transactions. So let's start by having a variable. I can close this for now. So we want to bind the value of this input. This, by the way, needs to be a number. It's going to be a number. So this is where the user is going to enter the amount of money that they want to save. And for binding inputs in Svelte, we first need to declare a new variable. So this is where the value of the input is going to be. So we are declaring a value, and in Svelte we only use variables. We don't have to use any use state or anything like that. We just declare variables, and what we need to do here is I'm going to use the bind keyword, and what we are going to bind is the value. So this is a HTML property of this tag, the value, and what this is going to equal, we need to use curly braces here. So this means that this content is dynamic, and I'm going just to pass the input. So this is telling as well that every time this input value changes, this is going to be updated. And for testing, we can add another tag here and for binding variables to the template, I can use curly braces again, and I'm going to display the input. So this should change every time we change the value of the input. So we have 0 at the start, and if I change this to 12, you can see that this is changing every time the value changes. So that's how we are binding the value. So we are binding the value, but we also need to bind the this select input. So for doing that, I'm going to declare another variable, and by the way, we need to use let, because these variables are going to change. We cannot use const. So I'm going to say type of transaction, and the first value is going to be the default, and it's going to have a plus. So it can be a plus or a minus. If it's a plus, it means that it's income, and if it's a minus, it means that is an expense. So I can have that, and what I want to do here is I want to bind this variable to the select. So I can say bind is the same. So the value is a DOM property that this tag has, and we can bind the type of transaction. So every time this changes, this value will be updated. But we actually need to declare the value here. So for doing that, I'm going to say value, and the value equals what the values that we are binding. And this is plus, and this is going to be minus. For testing this, I'm going to do the same thing, but now I'm going to bind the type of transaction here. So every time we change this also changes, and this is also working. So we are binding the values of the input, and this is pretty much what we need so far. Okay, so the next thing is going to be how we can load our transactions to the DOM and how we can display the transactions in the DOM. So the transactions are coming from the API, and for making calls to the API, we are going to import, and what we need to import here is Axios, because this is the tool that we are going to use to make API calls. So we import in Axios, and we also need another lifecycle function from Svelte. So we want to call to the API once everything on here has rendered. So for doing that, we can import from Svelte, and what we want to import is the owned. So we have two here with two lifecycle values functions. The one is destroy, and another one is mount. So destroy will be called every time this component disappears from the DOM, and on mount it will be every time everything renders to the screen. So what we are going to do is when everything mounts to the, we are going to call another function that is a callback, and we want to be this asynchronous, so we can use the async keyword. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const data const equals, so we are going to await, and here is where we use Axios. As I said before, you can use also fetch. So to make get calls, we can use Axios.get, and this is where we are going to be using, and what we want to call is API. So this is the endpoint that we declare in our backend, API transactions. So this is how we can access this from the server, and what Axios returns is an object that has the data. So we're calling the data, and we are destructing that from the response. We also have another things here like status and another things, but we are going only to use the data, and we need to assign this data to a variable, to some kind of state. So for doing that, I'm going to say late transactions, and at the beginning is going to be an empty array, but after we call to the API, we are going to replace that with our data from the server. Let's save that, and for testing this, I'm just going to have another property here that is going to be JSON.stringify, and we are going to stringify the transactions to see if this is working. So I'm going to pass the transaction so we can render that to the DOM to see if this is working correctly. So you can see that we have an empty array. So this is because we deleted all of our transactions. So let's add a new transaction with insomnia. I'm going to add this transaction and I'm going to send. We have the transaction. If we refresh this, we can see that now we have that. We successfully called the API and are retrieving the transactions. Okay. So we're having the transactions, but we might need to display this to the user in a different way because we don't want to pass some JSON here. I'm going to delete these tags because we don't longer need this anymore, and I'm going to use a Svelte feature that's called, we have logic blocks. So a logic blocks is a way to interact with data in the template, and the block that we are going to use is the each block. So this will interact with any array or object. So what we want to interact with is the transactions array. So we can say transactions. For each transaction, what we are going to do for is, as we are going to declare a new a variable, so we can access the transaction easily. So the transaction, the name that we're going to give it is going to be transaction, just like that. And we need to close this. So for closing, we use this syntax, and this means that this is closed. So for each transaction, we are going to use another Bulma CSS component or CSS class. So the class that we are going to use is called notification, and this for now will only have and this is how we combined here, as we used it before, transaction that value. So for each transaction, we are rendering this kind of div, and we are displaying the value to the user. So if we go back here, we can see that this is currently working. So we can add another one, let's say 30, and let's add one with this kind of, and if we refresh this, we have 3 of them because this is looping through that array and is creating new. I'm going just to add a HR here so we have some division. And the other thing that we need to do now is to be able to add new transactions through this input. So for doing that, I'm going to listen to the click event here in the save button, and for doing that in Svelte we can say on click equals, and here we are going to pass the function. So the function is going to be called transaction. This function currently does not exist, so we need to create that function, And for doing that, we just say function add transaction, and here's where we are going to have all the logic for doing that. So for doing that, we are just going to first declare a new variable, and this is going to be the object that we need to pass to the server. So as you know, this object has a date, so we are going to pass the date from here, and we are going to say the same as before, new date get time, and we are also going to pass the value, and the value is going to be the input. But we have a problem here, because if we are declaring two types of transactions, income and expenses. So what happens if this value, now this type of transaction, is an expense? So what we are going to do is we are going to check for the type of transaction, and we are going to say if this is equals to plus, we are going to use a ternary operator. So this is like saying if this is a plus, we are going to use the input as it is, but if it's not a plus, it is a minus, we are going to multiply the input by -1. So this will transform this to negative, and we know that this is an expense. So we are declaring the transaction. Now we need to send this to the server. So we can say const response equals, we are going to, this needs to be an asynchronous function, and we're going to await to Axios, again Axios, and for doing this we can use the post. So we have the post method for Axios, and what we are going to post is to the same URL as before, API transactions. But we need to send a body, and for doing that we just pass this as a second parameter in Axios, and what we need to pass is the transaction. So this is what we are sending to the backend. Once everything this is done, we can change our current array, because this is just pushing that to the backend, but we actually need to update this array. So for doing that, we can say transactions equal. So what another thing that we have to keep in mind with Svelte is that we cannot use the push methods, for example transactions that push, because Svelte, what it takes for changing values in the DOM is the equal operator. So every time we want to change something, we need to use the equal operator. So we can say transactions equals, and what we are going to do is we are going to have a new array that has the response that data. So this is coming from the response, is the same what we are passing, but this now has the ID, and I'm going to use the spread operator. So this is going to spread all the previous transactions that we have in this array. So this is just combining the response with the current arrays. And I also want to reset that to 0, because we are just changing the value of the input. So this is how we can add transactions. Now let's test this out here. So I'm just going to add a new transaction, and let's check the developer console to see if we are making the API call. So let me just add 12, and you can see that there we have it. We have 12, and this was using the API call. If I refresh this, I should have this. It's in the bottom, but we are going to fix that soon. For now it's in the bottom. And I also want to test if this is going to generate an expense. So this should be minus, and we should have a minus, let's say -4. So we have an expense, and if I save, I can see that this is passing the minus. Okay, now that's working, but we also need another thing. So we need a way to delete every transaction, and for doing that I'm going to use another function, but we need to have some kind of button for doing that, and I'm going to add this to the markup. So we have the value, but I also want to have a button, and this button is going to have the class delete. So this class comes from Bulma CSS, and as you can see, we have the icon by default there. And what we want to do here is add another listener that's going to listen to the click event, and when this is invoked, we're going to call another function that this one is going to call remove transaction. But we actually need to pass the value of which transaction we are going to remove. So I'm going to declare this as a callback here. I don't know what does this all the time. And I'm going to pass, what I'm going to pass here is the transaction. So this function knows which transaction we need to remove. So we are listening to that, but we haven't declared this function yet, so let's declare it now. And it's going to be kind of similar. We are going to have an async function that's called remove transaction. What we have here is the transaction, and what we are going to do here is we are going to make an API call to our backend. So we are going to say const response equals await. We're going to await to access that delete, and we need to pass. So I'm going to use this kind of syntax that allows me to have variables here, or I can just use it like this, and I can say API transactions, and we are going to concatenate that with transaction.id. So this is coming from here, and we are awaiting to that. And as you remember, we have a response as the ID, so we can say response data, and what the server is sending is the ID of what removed, and we can say if the ID of the response equals the ID of the transaction, so it means that this was success, we are going to remove that from the array. And for doing that, as you remember, we are going to replace the value of the transactions array of this array. We are replace that with a new value that's going to be like this. So we are reading the transactions array, and we are going to filter. What we are going to filter is, for every transaction we have a callback, and what we want to filter is the transaction ID. Okay, I remember that this is \ID. So we are going to have it like that, a transaction ID, and this should be different of what? Of the transaction that we are passing. So this is getting kind of ugly. I'm going to use just the ID here because I don't like how this is looking. So I can just use the ID here. And what I'm going to do, so I'm assigning that value, but I also need to change this to send directly the ID. So every time the user clicks, I'm going to send the ID to the function that's going to read the ID. It's going to send the request with the ID, and if everything went well, I'm going to remove that from the array of the DOM. So let's now test this out. So let's open this again, and we should be making API calls to remove these values. And we are removing the value, but we are actually done removing this from the DOM. If we refresh this, we can see that we have less values. So let's see what's going on here. Oh, I see. Date is data. Data.id equals ID. We are going to remove that from the server. So this should be working now, and you can see that we are removing. So there's a weird behavior here, is that if we remove this from here, it's not, sometimes it's not looking correctly. It's because we need to declare a key for each value. So this will tell Svelte which position it should be removed. So for doing that, this is the way we can tell that to Svelte. I'm going to read the transaction, and I'm going to pass the ID. So this is how we tell Svelte that this is going to be the key that's going to be used to identify every DOM value here. So we have that, but there's a problem here that I don't like, is that for every type of transaction, we are having the same color, and as you saw in the example, we have different colors. And I can do the following. So in Bulma we have some CSS classes, as you can see, that we can display. So we can dynamically change these classes. So for example, I can say, so this means that I'm going to write JavaScript here, and I can say transaction that value is greater than 0. If this is true, it means that it's an income. So if this is true, I'm going to have the is success class, and if it's not true, I'm going to have the is venture. So because if it's not true, it means that it is expense. And let's see if this is working. So as you can see, this is working correctly, and I can save this. There's another problem here, is that I having this zero value that I don't want to have. So for fixing that, I can disable this save button dynamically, and now we are going to be using another Svelte feature that's called reactive assignments. So I'm going to declare this variable that's going, and I'm going to use this syntax, disable. So this is the variable, and for declaring this variable, I'm going to say if transactions that if input equals 0. So every time the input changes, this value will be updated depending of the input. So we want this to be true every time the input equals 0, and we are going to bind this property to our button. So for doing that, I can say disabled. So this is another DOM property, and I'm going to pass a dynamic value, and this is going to be the same as disabled. So if this is true, will also be true. And as you can see, this is a shorthand that we have for saying the same thing. If I save, I should have disabled value because this is 0, but if we have 1, this was enabled. And I can test it again and we can see. We also don't want undefined. So right now this is undefined. So I can use some JavaScript magic. So I can just say input if there's not input. So this will check, as you know, this could be a feature or could be a bug, but this will check if this is 0 and also check if this is null or undefined, because this is how JavaScript works. So this is working, and if we delete, this is also disabled, but if we have add a number, this is enabled, and now this is working. Okay, so I don't really like how these notifications are showing, and I'm going to use is liked. This is another Bulma class, and this is going to change a little bit this, so it looks more clear. So this is what we have so far. Okay, what I want here is I want to have some kind of computer property that is computing the balance of the income and the expenses, and I'm going to use another reactivity statement. So this one is going to be called balance, and what this balance is going to be is just the sum of all the values that we have for each transaction. So for adding these values, I can use the transactions. I'm going to use this method, this array method called reduce. So what reduce does is takes every part of an array is going to have an accumulator that we can be using every iteration of this loop. So the first parameter is going to be the callback that we are receiving, and the first parameter of this callback is the accumulator, and the second one is going to be our array, so in this case the transaction. And the second parameter of the reduce function is the initial value. So because we are computing this, the initial value will be 0, and then we can start adding through this value, and this is what I'm going to do here. So I can say accumulator. So this is what will happen every interaction is going to return the accumulator, and we are going to add the transaction, that value. So this is the value that every transaction has, and what we are doing here, we are just computed this, so we know what is the balance. For displaying this in the site, I'm going to have another. After this, I'm going to have another notification. This is going to add the CSS class, and I'm going to use this value, this balance value. So I can just use it here, and we should have now the balance, and you can see that is adding and then subtracting this value. So for example, if I'm going to add I'm going to have an expense of 32, this should be 0, and there we have it, we have 0. And now if I remove any value from here, it should compute that again. So let me remove this, and you can see that this is working. Let me just add another class here so it looks better. I want to use isInfo class, so it has a color, and I am also going to use the isLiked class. Another class that I want to center what is inside. So I'm going to let me save this, and it did not it was not safe, and we have it blue, and I'm going to use the Vulma CSS class here called has text centered, so this will center our text. Okay, so we just have the value, but let me add some label. So I will have something like balance and colon, and we have it like that. And let me make this strong, use the strong, so we have this stands out from the rest. Okay, we have the balance. Now we need another way to compute the total, the amount of income that we have, and also the amount of expenses. So for doing that, we are also going to be using another reactivity assignment. So I'm just going to say income, and this is going to do the same, but in this case, before reducing, I'm going to apply a filter to this array. So I'm going to filter, and what I'm going to filter here, I also have here the transaction and a callback for each transaction, and I want to filter, because this is the income, I want to filter the ones that are greater than 0, and this is going to give me that. So I only have the income, and for doing the expenses, so I can say expenses, and I can do the same thing here, but in this case I'm going to have the ones that are less than 0. So these ones are the expenses, and because these ones have a negative value, because plus against minus equals minus, this will still work, and I can use the plus operator. So let me make use of that. Let me add some spaces here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this Vulma CSS class called columns, and I can have 2 columns, so I can have 2 columns. I have 2 columns, and what I want to add here is I want to add another card that has the values. So this is going to be income, and we are going to find the income here, and this is going to be the expenses, and I'm going to find the expenses here. Let me save, and now let's check, and there we have it. There's something not working correctly here, so let's check that out. So we are filtering the ones that are greater than 0. Oh, I see what's the issue here. So we are comparing the entire object, so that's why it's filtering everything. We need to access the value of each transaction, so I'm going to access the value, and this now should work. Yep, we are computing the income and the expenses. And for this one, I'm going to use a different classes, of course. So we can use in this one, because it's the income, I can use is success. And here I'm going to use the is danger. So we have different colors there. Okay, that looks better. And this is main, I think this is the most that I want to have for now. For this, we can add more values, and this still works. But I don't really like how we structure everything in here, because we have everything in one big component. Maybe I want to have some components so everything is more organized. So I am going to do that now. I'm going to create a new folder called components, and I'm going to have, I think I'm going to have a component for each transaction, and I'm going to also have another component for each summary that we have here, so we don't have to have all of this repeated. So I'm going to create that. The first component is going to be called transaction, and we need to use the Svelte extension. And what I need here is I need this information. So I'm just going to copy this, and there we have it. And the compiler is complaining because we don't have these values declared. So I'm going to start adding that. Okay, for doing that, I can declare the script tag, and I'm going to declare those variables, transaction. And I also need the remove transaction. But I don't want this to be local from this component, because this means that I will have to declare these variables here. I actually want this to come from the outside as properties. And for doing that, Svelte has this syntax that we can use the export keyword. So the export keyword will tell Svelte that these properties are coming from the outside. So we are going to pass these as properties. So now this is not complaining anymore. And what I want to do here is I'm going to import this component. So I'm going to import transaction with uppercase T, and I'm going to import this from components. This is the folder where we have our components, and this is called transaction.svelte. So we now have the component imported, but now we need to use it. So we can use the component here. So this is what we are replacing, and we can say transaction, and this component needs some properties. So as you remember, if we go back here, we need the transaction and we need this function. So we are going to pass that. So for doing that, I'm going to say transaction, this is the property, equals transaction that's coming from here, and I can just add that, and we have this shorthand. So every time I save, actually this is converted to the shorthand. That's why we are having that behavior, and this is the same thing as what I had before. So the next thing that I want to pass is the remove transaction. So this is the function that we declared here. I'm going to pass this to the child so it can be used there. and I can remove this, and this should be working. Yeah, it keeps working. So another component that I want to have a generic component that can handles the balance, that also can handles the income and the expenses, the summary of this. So I'm going to call these components summary card. It's going to have the Svelte extension, and we can use this like this. This is what we need. So we have the syntax, but we need the value, and we might also need to know which type of CSS class this is going to have. So for doing that, I'm going to say I'm going to add my script tag, and I'm going to declare. So this will no longer be called balance. This is going to be called now because this is a property. This is going to be called export let value equals. So this is going to be called value, and the initial value will be 0. So we have a default property, and I'm going to use this here. So this is how we tell Svelte that this is the default value that we can have. And I also want to have this mode variable. So this will be which type of card, of summary card we are using. So this can be balance, this can also be income or expenses. The default one is going to be balance. Okay, we have that, but we don't want to have this here hard-coded because this could be used in different ways. So I can use another reactivity statement and say that the label is going, what the label is going to look like is going to take the mode and is going to transfer this to uppercase. Because the mode is in lowercase, we want to transform this to uppercase, and we can now display this to the user. So we are going to pass the label here. So we have the label, but we also need the CSS class. So for doing this, we can have a function that's going to compute the CSS class, and we can say function get CSS class, and it's going to have the mode as a parameter, and we can have a switch case statement. So the key is going to be the mode. So we are testing the mode, and case, if the case is balance, so we are going to return, and the CSS class that we have for balance is info. So we have that for balance, but we also need this one for, let's say, income. So for income, we are going to have is success. And there's one mode that we are missing, that is going to be expenses. So if the mode is expenses, the CSS class is going to be is danger. So we have our CSS classes with our function, So now let's use this with a reactivity statement that we can say CSS class equals get CSS class, and we are passing the mode. So we are passing this variable, and this will be computed every time, and we have the correct class. So now let me use that here, so we no longer need this hard-coded, and we can use the CSS class reactivity property. So we have our component ready to be used. So let me go back here, and we can start using it. So I'm going to import summary card from, and we have this in components summary card.svelte. So this is the component, and we can start using the component. So the first place is going to be here, and I can say summary card, and we are using the component, but remember that we have to pass some values. We have to pass the value, and we also have to pass the mode. And because this is the first one, the mode is going to be, we can pass this as a string, it's going to be balance. And we need to pass the value, so the value is going to be the balance. So we are passing the value, and this should be working. As you can see, this is working. So we can see that there's something missing here. We need to have this here, so we can differentiate. Okay, so let me just copy this, and this is another component that we are going to use here, another instance of the component, but this time it's not going to be balance, it's going to be the income, and the value is going to be our income property. And here we are going to use the expenses mode, and what we are going to pass here is the expenses property that we already computed. So let me use that here. Expenses. So there is something wrong here. Okay, now it crashed before. So we have our balance, our income, and our expenses. And we are using just one component to make this happen. So let me see if this keeps computing the value. And it's working right now. Okay, another nice feature that we can have with Svelte is that we have transitions by default, so we don't have to use any kind of third-party library for doing transitions. So let's use that here. So this component will enter and leave the DOM because we are using the each clause. So I'm going to import from Svelte /transition, And what I want to import is a transition called slide. So this is the transition that I'm going to use, and this transition for using this we can use a directive that Svelte has that's called transition. So we can add this to any DOM element, and we use colon, and then we can pass the transition here. So this is what we import, and this is what we are using here. So this transition effect will be used every time this component leaves or enters the DOM. So, and as you can see, it's really simple to use. And if we check back, if we add another item, we can see that this is sliding to the DOM. So there we have it. So we can also pass some properties here. So let's say I want, and this has to be an object, and can also be a function to have more configuration, but let's use the object now. So we can change the duration, and we can say the duration of this animation is going to be a little bit slower. It's going to last 2 seconds, 2000 milliseconds, that's 2 seconds. So as you can see, this is really slow, and we might don't want that. So let me change that to 500, and that looks better. Okay, so there's a couple of more things that I want to add to this application. The first one is that if we don't have any transaction here, I would like to display a message to the user. And the other one is that I am not sorting this, and I'm not displaying any kind of information about the date, because if I save this and I keep adding this, if I refresh, you can see that this is not showing up correctly. This is because we are not sorting this information. So again, I'm going to use another Svelte reactivity statement, and this is going to be called sort transactions equals, and we are going to use the transactions object that we have here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the sort array method, and here we have 2 values, the first and the second value. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, because as you remember, the dates are numbers, we can use this as numbers. So I'm going to subtract the b date from the a date. So this is going to show the latest ones first, and this is sorting. Now let's use this in our template. So right now we are using the transactions object directly, but we can actually use this variable. So this is now going to be using that variable that is sorting every transaction. So we have, as you can see, we have the correct order now. So if we add that and we refresh, we're still showing this in the correct order. So another thing that we might want to display this to the user, the date. So let me do that. So I'm going to add this here, and this is going to have a span property and a span tag, and I can say new date, and what we want to display here is the date that we have in the transaction. So here we have the date and number, and we are passing this to the constructor. So we don't want to show to the user a number. We can actually use this method called toLocalString, and this is going to show the date in a better way. As you can see, we have in a proper format, and we have this for every element in our DOM. And I don't like how this is looking, so I'm going to add some classes. This is going to be size 7, so this is another CSS class by Bulma, and I'm going to change the color. For doing that, I can use text gray, and I'm also going to use a local class that I can use here. So I'm going to use the style tag, and I can say date. So this is what I used here. This has to start with a dot, and I'm going to float this to the right. So this should be looking better. We have our date and is correctly showing in the right. So let me add another thing here. So as I mentioned before, what I want to do here is, if the user does not have any transaction, I want to show any kind of message, so they can know, because they don't have any balance or income or expenses. So what I'm going to use now is another Svelte feature that is, well, we already use logic blocks, but we are going to use now is called if blocks. So I'm going to save if. So this is how I declare a new if block. If transactions, I'm going to change for the length is greater than 0. I'm going to display all of this, and I can close this here, and as you can see, we are not showing anything, but I want to show a message to the user. So what I'm going to have here is, I'm going to use the else. So this is like an if else. If this is not true, this is what is going to be rendered to the screen. And I'm going to just have a notification class that's going to say add your first transaction. So you can see that we now have this message. So if we don't have any transaction, we have that, and now when I save, this is gone, and I now have this UI. Okay, so the last thing here is that when we load this for the first time, we have an empty state, and what I'm going to control that, and I add some progress bar, so you know that the user knows that this is loading. So for doing that, I'm going just to have a loading flag that's going to be false, and at the beginning, when this is loading, I'm going to say loading equals true. So this will be true, and once this is fulfilled, we are going to restore this variable to a false state. So we are controlling that, and now I'm going to show a progress bar. So I'm going to create a new component called loading, and what this is going to have is going to have it's just going to be a progress. It's going to be a progress DOM tag. So this tag is from the DOM, but we can have some class. So for example, and this class is coming from Bulma. So progress, this is the class that we want to use, is small, so it's not so much big. And I'm also going to use the isInfo, so it has some color. And the max value is going to be 100. And this is going to be animated when we use it. So I'm going to again import this component, and this component is called progress from progress. And let me put it here, so just to see how this is looking. So I'm just going to use the component. No, this is not called progress, this is called loading. Loading from loading. Okay, and you can see that we have this, but we are only going to show this to the user when this is loading. So for doing that, I'm going to, this is our component, and this is also going to be an if block, if loading, and we are closing. If loading is true, we are going to display this to the user. So as you can see, it's because our server is really fast, this is not taking any time, and that's why we don't see it, but that should be shown if the backend is loading. And we also need to add another property here. So I don't want to show this every time, because as you can see, this is also be shown every time we refresh. We are seeing that, and that's because we are just using an else statement here. So we can use an else if, and it's not loading, and now this should not be shown. As you can see, we only have the progress bar, and then we have the message there. The last and final thing that I'm going to add to this application is that I want to have some kind of store management. So this is actually right now this is a really simple application, but we can add store management, really state management, global state management, really simple with as well. So let's see how we can do that. So store management means that we maybe don't want to be passing these variables, for example this transaction, this kind of or properties. We don't want to pass this to the components. We are going to be reading this value from a centralized place, and for doing that, the only thing that we can do here is we can add an stores file, and this is where all our stores are going to be. So I can say import from Svelte /store. So we have the store in the Svelte library, and what I'm going to use is the writable store. So this will mean that the store can be it's going to be writable. So what I want to save in the store is the transactions, so we don't have to pass this to the other components. So I can say export, and this is because we are going to be using this from the outside. Export cons transactions equals writable, and what we pass here is the initial value. So the initial value, as you remember, is an empty array. So now, instead of reading from this local variable, I am going to use the store, and for doing that I can just import from the stores, and what I'm going to import is the transactions. So we have that, and we no longer need this here. So if we go back here, we have an error, and this is because the transactions is actually an object, and the way we can use this is accessing the properties of that object. For example, we have this kind of properties that have set, subscribe, and update. So set allows us to write a new value. Subscribe will allow to reset the values. Subscribe is for listening to reading the value, and update. And we could be using this, but actually Svelte has a really nice way of using these stores is by using $sign in front of every variable that we are reading from the store. So what this is telling is the Svelte compiler is going to generate that subscribe method, and after that we can read directly from this variable. So in that way we can easily read that value. So I'm going to change all the reference of transactions. Here we have another reference of transactions, and here we are assigning a new value to the store. Here we have another. We are pushing that to the transactions array. So this is all the places that I need to change to update the value. Make sure that you have all the transactions reference. I am missing one here. This one should not be like that because it's coming from here. And let me see if we have another one. Seems that we have covered everything. So we don't want to change this one, of course. Okay, we also need to add this here, and that should be it. So now we are reading this from the store, and if I reload this should be working as before. Yeah, and this is working. And we can delete, we can add, we can read from the store. Okay, so we are having this here, but we can actually have these property values in another place, in a centralized place, so we don't have to declare this here. We can also declare these variables here. So I'm just going to copy all of these computer with the exception of the disable. This one we want to keep locally, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to export const Okay, let me clear this. And what we are going to use, let me just remove all of this. This is causing confusion. So what I'm going to use here is the derive store. So this can be derived from another store, and what I want to derive here is the sorted transactions. It's going to have the derived. We're going to use the derive. We first need to pass the store. So the store is transactions, and then we have a callback with the current value. So I can say value, and this is where I can use what I have here. So value that sort, and we are going to sort through that value. Okay, we have that. Now we need to add another one for the balance. Export const balance equals derived, and what we are going to pass here, again, the transactions, and we can use the value. Okay, we didn't use that correctly here, so we need to have the value as a function, and this is what we are going to be returning. The same here, I need to have this as a function, and I can use the value here, the same method that we had here. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to reduce the value. Okay, so we are reducing the value, and we are computing the balance here. Let's copy this and add two ones more. So this one is going to be called income, and this one is going to be called expenses. And what we need here, as you remember, we need to filter. We need to filter first, and for each transaction we're going to filter the ones that are greater than 0. And what we want to filter here is the ones that are less than 0. So we have the same as before, but now we are using this store, and instead of having all of this here, I'm going to be using the value from the store. So the first place that I want to use is sorted. Let me see if I sorted transaction. So we can sorted transactions, and we can use that here with the $sign. Okay, and I am going to also import the income and the expenses and the balance from there, and I'm going to use that here with the $sign. So we have centralized everything, all of our stores in one place. Now if I go back, you can see that this works as before. The only thing that have changed is that now we have our information we have in these stores, and we can use everything from there with this $sign. So this is how we can implement stores into Svelte. It's really simple. We only need to use this syntax, and we can also write this syntax, and we can write and read through the stores. Okay, now it's time to deploy the application to the internet. So we are going to do a couple of things before deploying to Heroku. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going back to the server.js file, and what I want to do here is that I want to serve static files every time the user enters our URL, because right now we are only serving the API endpoints. So we want to serve our Svelte application. And for doing that, I'm going to use a middleware by Express that first I'm going to check if we are in production. So I can check that checking the env variable called node env, and if this variable equals production, that means that we are in production. We are going to be serving the static files. So for doing that, I'm going to use a middleware called express.static, and we need to have the root of the root that we want to serve. So as you remember, we have everything here in the public folder in the client. So this is where our application is going to be. So we can say client./public. So this is what we want to have static files, and when the user is trying to access any any route, we are going to say request response, and we are going to response that send we have just res that send file. So we are going to be serving the index.html. So for resolving that file, I'm going to use path from the Node library. So path, and this is going to have the correct path, and I'm going to say path.resolve, and it's going to have dir name, the current folder name, and then we are going to have the client, and then we are going to have public, and the file that we want to send is the index.html. So this is going to be called in when the user tries to enter any path in our application. Make sure that you deleted the previous hello world endpoint that we have. We don't longer need that. We are going to be using this instead, and of course we still need our API endpoints and routes. So that's what we need here. So now we also need to have some scripts. So Heroku needs some scripts to run. So the first script that Heroku needs is the start script, and this is going to only use Node for running, and what we are going to be running is the server.js file. So this is going to be invoked when our application run in the server, and we need another script that's going to be called build. So this script is going to be called when we are deploying our application to Heroku, and this script, what it's going to do is going to build the client. So for doing that, if we go back to here to the package.json of the client, we can see that we have a build script that's going to build our application. So we can say npm run. So the first thing that we want to do is install, because this will not be installed because it's by default. So we need to install the client libraries, and I'm going to use the prefix so it knows that this needs to be run in the client. And when this is installed, we're going to run npm run build, and again we need to run this in the client. This is really important. So we are building our application, and now let's test if this is working. So make sure that you are not in the client folder. I'm going to go back, and now I am in the root of the project, and I'm going to run npm run build in the package JSON of the server, and this should be installing our dependencies and then building our application. So you can see that it worked correctly. So now that we have set up everything, let's jump into Heroku. Okay, so I am in the Heroku landing page, and what I want to do here, what you need to do here is sign up for a new account if you haven't already. So you will need to follow all of these steps. I'm not going to do that because I already created an account, but you should be able to do it. Okay, once you have created your account, you will have this kind of a screen. So we are going to add a new application. Make sure that you pick the correct language. That's in our case Node.js when you sign up, and this is going to create a new application for Node.js. So the app name is going to be Svelte Expenses Tracker, and this is going to check if this URL is available. You might need to use a different URL, and the region is going to be United States for now. And let's create this application. So here we have, let me make this bigger. We have some instructions for deploying our application. So the first thing that you will need is you will need the Heroku CLI. So let's open this, and you can see that we have some installers, or you can also use Brew, or in Windows the installers. I'm not going to do this because I already installed this. And the next thing that you want to do is logging into your account. So let's go back here. I'm going to clear this and make it bigger. So let's first that we have Heroku in our system. So we can say Heroku version, and we have Heroku. So I'm going to log out of my account because I'm logged in a different account, and I'm now going to log in. So I'm going to just copy this, and I'm going to log in. So press any key to open a browser, and this will open a browser for you where you can log in into your account. You can close this page and return to your CLI. You should be now logged in, and you can see that we are now logged in our account. Once we have that, let's see, we also need to cd into the project. We have to git init create, make sure that you have Git installed in your computer before doing this, and then we can add Heroku. So this is very important. Make sure that you are in the root of the project, not in the client. So now we can initialize a new Git repository. Before doing that, I'm going to add a new file called git ignore, and we can see that we already have that. But if you don't have it, please create this file. And what we want to have here is the Node modules folder, because we don't want to check the Node modules to Git because it's really big and there's a lot of files there that doesn't belong to Git. So make sure that you have that, and once you have that file in the server, the client already have it because it came out with the boilerplate. So we can say git init. So we have initialized our Git repository, and the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to add the remote. You should have a different command here depending on the name that you gave it. So I'm going to run this command, Heroku git remote Svelte, and this is going to set the remote. Now we need to push to this remote. So first I'm going to add all of my staged files, so I can stage my files, and now I can make a commit, git commit /am for message, and we can say first commit, and we can close this. Oops. Okay, we have a clean tree now. Now, before trying to push this, we actually need one more step. Let me clear this out. As you remember, we are using this Mongodb in the locally. So what we need to do here is to push this variable to Heroku, and for doing that we can say Heroku config set Mongodb equals, and I'm going to paste the value that I have here. So make sure that you have your own Mongodb that you created before. So this is only if you don't have the value here, if you have the value in an environment variable. And this, what it's going to do is going to create this variable in Heroku. So I think we have to use quotes here. Okay, you need to be careful that you need to use quotes for this variable, and you can see that it was created with this value. So we have our Mongo URL in the server, and the other thing that we want to have is we want to have another variable to be able to install the client in the server. So if we go back here to the client, to the package.json, you can see that we have a lot of dev dependencies that we need to build our application. And if we don't specify this variable, your application will not be served, will not be built. So this variable is going to be the same. We need the Heroku config set is going to be npm production npm config production equals false. So this is going to add this variable, and this is important because if we don't add this, your dev dependencies will not be installed in the server. So we need to add that, and you can see that now we have that in the Mongo. We can check that here. So if we go back, here, we can see that we have the variables set. Okay, now is the moment to push our changes. So we already committed, so we now need to push this to the server. So for doing that, we're going to use git push Heroku, and this is the name of the origin, and this what we want to push is master. So this is going to push all of our changes to Heroku. Okay, so now it's installing all the dependencies in the server. So now it's building the application. It first installed the dependencies and now it's building. It should not take too much time. Now it built the application. The application is built, and we can see that it seems that everything went well. And there it is. We have released the application, deployed the application. So let's check if this is working. Let's open a new URL, and here we should have our application. So there we have it. We have our application in the internet, and you can change this to any domain that you want, but we are going to be using this one. And you can see that this is working. We can add a new value, and this is pushing to our API. And if we refresh this, we can see that this is still there, and we can also delete everything. Thank you so much for following this course. Hopefully you find it useful. And if you like this content, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can have more content like this. And I will see you in the next time.